I'd like to thank the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada, InterAcademy Partnership, and all young academies involved in organizing or hosting this conference. Allow me first to introduce myself. I'm Rula Abdelmasih, former biology professor at the University of Balamand in Lebanon. I recently moved to the US, where I'm a community educator at Central Michigan University. I'm also the co-chair of TWAS Young Affiliates Network, TIAN, and I will be moderating session 9 on how to promote inclusiveness in open access publishing models. To give you an overview, according to UNESCO, open science, and here I'm going to quote, is a movement aiming to make science more open, accessible, efficient, democratic, and transparent. It combines various movements to make multilingual scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone, to increase scientific collaboration and sharing of information for the benefits of science and society, end of quote. Following the UNESCO recommendation, many initiatives were developed. However, during the 2021 International Open Access Week, ALLEA released a statement entitled Equity in Open Access, which addressed how open access publishing routes and large read and write deals contribute to establishing inequitable structures within academic research. Moreover, the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2022 set an important precedent by recommending inclusive publishing and distribution channels. Along the same line, TWAS Young Affiliates Network, TIAN, and the Argentinian Young Academy developed a joint initiative focused on the impact on early career researchers, particularly those from developing countries, emphasizing the extremely high and in most cases unfair publication costs for authors. These initiatives, among others, promote awareness on the fact that although open science has the potential of making the scientific process more inclusive, however, many challenges limit the goal of reducing knowledge gaps, such as the costs of article processing charges, APCs, associated with some open access publication models. The aim of this session is to initiate discussion on open access and article processing charges to help in identifying strategies on how to overcome these challenges to reach true inclusiveness in the open access publishing models. We will start with a pre-recorded presentation, 10 to 12 minutes from each speaker, at the end of which we will open the floor for questions and discussions. Please add your questions in the Q&A box anytime. You can also upvote a question or comment that you like. Allow me now to introduce our distinguished speakers, Professor Ariel Silber, University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, Professor María Cetto, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, Professor Abdullah Shams bin Tariq, University of Rajshahi, Bangladesh, Professor Fernanda Beigel, CONICET-National University of Cuyo, Argentina, Professor Luc Drury, ALLEA, the European Federation of Academies of Science and Humanities in Germany. As per the recommendation from the organizers, and for the sake of time, please check the IAP conference webpage for full biographies. We will start with the first presentation by Professor Ariel Silber. Professor Ariel, the floor is yours. Can we start Professor Ariel's presentation, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Ariel Silber. I am from the University of Sao Paulo, and I will talk about this question that entitled this talk, which is open access really inclusive? So before starting, I would like to introduce two of my colleagues with have been thinking and reflecting together about this issue on the last few years, and we produced some documents that can be reached through internet or under request. They are Marcus Oliveira from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and Alicia Kowaltowski from the University of Sao Paulo. So I will start talking about a bit about an aspect of our current scientific culture which correlates academic legitimacy with the production of the highest possible number of high quality papers, and this in brackets, because we need to state that high quality papers often in our scientific community means papers published in journals with high impact factor. So the mandate in our community is to publish as much papers as possible in journals with the highest impact factor as possible. And this many often becomes a condition to obtain or to keep an employment or to be promoted or to obtain funds for conducting our research. In our words, this is the famous and old publish or perish. So this caused, of course, an explosion of the number of published articles in the last few decades, as it is shown in this graphic, and this pushed an exponential growth in the number of journals or venues in which our research is published. Until the beginning of this millennium, the predominant system for publishing articles was based on subscription on journals that worked based on subscriptions, meaning that people belonging to institutions that were able to subscribe determined title of journal can have full access to the articles published in it, which else are resguarded behind a paywall. The open access disseminated a different idea, which consisted in that authors, funders, or institutions should pay for disseminating their knowledge, and this would become accessible to everyone. Another difference is that authors and institutions can keep the copyrights of the material published. So the main ideas behind the open access movement was to make available the information derived from our research to every single human being in the world, which looks very humanistic, and that authors would keep the copyrights of their production. The question that came quite quickly once this idea started to be disseminated is, who will pay the bill? And the answer that came from the editorial houses mostly was too much easy. And it was that authors must obtain the funds, preferably from funders, to pay the so-called article processing charges, or APCs. At the beginning, it was thought as a way to cover the costs of publishing and disseminating the scientific information, but very quickly it became a big business, as I will show in some minutes. So this model in which authors pay and the information becomes immediately available to everyone was the so-called gold open access model. Other models emerged in the last years, like the green, the bronze, and the diamond. The diamond maybe is the most interesting one because the APCs are removed, so authors can publish for free, and the contents are distributed for free in the community and to everyone that it is interested, and the journals, the cost of the journals are covered by foundations, funding bodies, or philanthropists, for example. The problem is that in many cases, all reputed journals working under the open access system are following the model gold, meaning that to publish in a reputed journal, in most of cases, the publication must be paid and APCs applies. This creates a complicated circle, which is fueled by the desperation of academics and students for publishing papers in reputed journals to have a progression in their careers, their research. This creates, of course, a pressure on funding agencies to pay whatever the price for publication. And this, in the context of an unregulated and oligopolic editorial market, makes pushes an explosive increase in the APCs. And which is the relationship between the impact factors of the journals and the APCs? Well, there are several works showing that there is a very direct relationship, but I choose to show this table in particular from this paper, in which they analyze the increase of APCs between 2011 and 2021. And they show that the increase of the APCs in this decade in high impact factor journals measured using two different measurements for defining this population of journals is much higher, it's double than the increase experienced by journals with low impact factors. And this is complicated because this creates a link between an aspect of our assessment culture and a business run by the private sector, mainly by the big editorial houses. And this is a very big business. In fact, it's a business that altogether moves globally some $25 billion per year with average profits in the range of 30%. And as most of people in the audience probably know, the average prices, current prices for APCs are in the range of an unjustifiable $2,000, and in some cases of some very high impact factor journals have APCs that cross the barrier of the $11,000, which is absolutely unjustifiable from the point of view of the analysis of costs. What is the Coalition S and what it has to do with that? Well, the Coalition S is a group created in 2018 in Europe with the goal of accelerating the open access movement globally, okay? And they stated, and this is quoted from their homepage, that with effect from 2021, last year, all scholarly publication on the results from research funded by public or private grants provided by national, regional, and international research councils and funding bodies must be published in open access journal on open access platforms or made immediately available through open access repository without embargoes, okay? Meaning that the information would be made available immediately. Which is the problem with that? The problem with that is that the only way of complying with the Plan S is to publish and to comply with the Plan S and publish in reputed journals is to publish in journals that works under the gold model, meaning that it's necessary to pay whatever the price to have our research published in a reputed journal complying with Plan S. And this creates, of course, a new barrier that it is not depending on which people in which institutions are able to pay or not for a subscription, but which people in which institutions are able to pay for publishing their research and disseminating their research in reputed and well-considered journals. And this is creating a new barrier, particularly for those countries with emerging economies and emerging developing scientific systems. And Brazil, for example, is one of these cases. So to give the audience an idea of which is the degree, which is the magnitude of the impact of the Plan S, I brought here some numbers. We know that Brazil published in the between 2013 and 2018 approximately 56,000 papers per year. If we imagine that all these papers were published under golden open access journals at an average price of APC per paper of $1,800, which was the average that applied during this period, The total budget that Brazil would have dedicated to publish and to disseminate the science produced in the country would be in the range of $100 million. This is, for the audience to have an idea, half of the budget that our main funding agency, the CNPq, our main federal funding agency, the CNPq, had for the entire year of 2021. Of course, this is absolutely unaffordable. What can be done? Well, there are not magical recipes for having a response to that, but we have some things that we can do inside the academic community. In first place, I think it is very necessary to be solidary and to understand the circumstances of our colleagues that cannot afford the APCs. So we need to be aware that many often our colleagues are not publishing in the most reputed journals, not because of the quality of their science, but because of the economical circumstances of the funding bodies they have access to, for example. Another important thing is to increase the awareness in the scientific community, to increase the awareness of the corrosive market strategies of Plan S. We are following, for example, this suggestion of these authors that are from Africa, and we are doing this in our groups, for example, to discuss with our students and postdocs and make some accounts when we publish a paper and pay for the APCs. So we make the exercise of imagining how many months of a PhD or a master student scholarship we could pay with this money, how many fungible materials for making new experiments we could buy, or how many visits of students to colleagues' labs we could fund with this money, and so on. So this helps to create an idea of the real size of the problem. A very important issue is to consider a change in our publishing culture towards preprints and affordable or free open access journals. For example, to consider the publication and the support to diamond open access journals that are many often not so well known and not so well reputed because they are more new, but sometimes they have very consistent editorial boards, and they have a very selective editorial policies for publishing high quality science. Derived from this, it is very important to rethink and revise our current scientific assessment policies to embrace new publishing venues. On the side of the funders, we are proposing, and we are having talks with funding bodies here in Brazil, for example, it is very important to negotiate, that the funders start to negotiate with the editorial houses reasonable APCs. And another important point is to cap the funding for APCs. So we have an argument to discuss and to ask for waivers to the editors of journals, saying, okay, we are not funded to pay the APCs you are asking for. So we can have a strong argument saying that we are not allowed to use our funds in this way. Finally, to convince funders to create and or support other open or journals working on other open access models such as Diamond. The most, probably the most naive side of my talk is this one, and which is what the editorial houses could do. So in first place, to have transparent, flexible and generous policies of waivers, not based only on macroeconomical parameters. For example, most of editorial houses use as a criterion to consider or not a waiver the GDP per capita calculated by the World Bank of the country of procedence of the researcher that it is asking for the waiver, which creates a very odd situation many often. And of course, we could ask them to be reasonable with the APCs and to become our partners and not the predatory beast that we sometimes feel they are behaving as. Finally, again, I would like to insist that this is the product of a joint reflection with Alicia and Marcus. These are our contacts, and please feel free of contacting us in case of any questions or further discussions. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you. If we can move to the next presentation by Professor María Cetto.
By greeting the audience and thanking the organizers for having invited me to speak at this session, in which we are challenged to discuss how to promote inclusiveness in open access publishing models. As you can see, my talk bears the title, Genuine Open Access, Necessary but Not Sufficient for Inclusiveness. This session gives me the opportunity to refer specifically to the context of our region, Latin America, which includes the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. We have the great advantage that non-commercial journal publishing is widespread in Latin America, thanks to journals being mostly produced and supported by academic or scientific institutions, the majority of which are public. They take it as part of their responsibility to create and maintain their journals, and fortunately they have not given up on it, even in times of austerity. In addition, as you can see from the slide, there are a series of information services and other initiatives that support and disseminate our academic journals. Such initiatives make up today a truly regional publishing ecosystem. Latindex is part of this ecosystem through two databases. One is the directory, which is a broad inventory with more than 26,000 registered journals, and the second one is a catalog, which is a subset composed only of those journals that meet editorial quality criteria. To date, 3,000 journals have managed to enter the catalog, and the process continues. Moreover, and this is an important part of our services, we promote good editorial practices and provide training to editors through courses and workshops, also on a free basis. There are no hidden padlocks. Contrary to claims often found in the literature linking predatory practices to open access, we can safely say that such practices are neither a cause nor a consequence of genuine open access, that is, of free, non-commercial open access. Such practices are due to other causes, as is stated in the report of the InterAcademy partnership, which is copied on this slide. In fact, fraudulent journals, which are commercial because that is what they live on, have little roots in the region. It is more common for our authors to fall prey to predatory journals published in other countries outside the region. Genuine open access is no business. Even so, as you may see from this graph, there are some publishers in Iberoamerica that do their business, taking advantage of the pressure to publish that academics are subject to. Rather than isolated journals, they are just a handful of publishers that produce collections of journals in a diversity of disciplines. Of the over 26,000 journals registered in the Latindex directory, which, by the way, includes those from Spain and Portugal and also journals on Ibero-American studies, more than 12,000 are accessible online. In the Latin American countries, there are only less than 40 spurious journals out of a total of 112. Most of the suspicious journals apply article processing charges, but we cannot rely on this as the only indicator, since 57 journal titles that apply APCs are in the catalog. This has not prevented their entry. We do apply a filter, though, When edited by a commercial or private publisher, the journal must be previously indexed in DOAG or in Cielo. Anyway, through our courses, workshops, and professional advice, we continuously promote and support non-commercial publishing in line with the tradition of the region. Not only does it prevent proliferation of spurious for-profit journals, but more importantly, it ensures inclusiveness in the sense that all users, of course those who are connected to the internet, but be it authors, librarians, students, readers, policy analysts, you name it, all of them have free and open access to the journals and their contents with no paywalls. Contrary to what happens with the so-called open access APC model or with the transformative models. Such models mean closed access for a majority of institutions of scientists as authors and as readers, especially from the countries of the South who cannot afford to pay APCs or subscriptions, which results in the widening of the knowledge gaps. Now, why do I say that genuine open access is a necessary but not sufficient condition for inclusiveness? Because there are other kinds of barriers or walls. One of them is language. The UNESCO recommendation on open science rightly states that it supports making multilingual scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone to increase scientific collaboration and sharing of information for the benefits of science and society. This is more easily said than done. Looking again at the Latin American region, Spanish, despite being the main language spoken by over 500 million people, has virtually disappeared from mainstream scientific literature in the last 4 decades. It has not disappeared altogether from science, fortunately, because it is still the language used in university courses and outreach activities. But scientists who want to publish their research work, to be read and cited, increasingly turn to English, with the obvious disadvantage of it not being their mother tongue. This disadvantage acts as a barrier in actual practice. Yet in most scientific disciplines, and especially in the natural and exact sciences, the specialized journals produced in the region are also turning to English as their main and sometimes their only language for publication. This trend is, in the present circumstances, irreversible. More broadly speaking, although Spanish is the mother tongue for the majority of Latin Americans, it is not the only one. We have, of course, Portuguese, which faces a similar problem, or worse than Spanish. And in the other extreme, we have a vast number of native or indigenous languages which hardly make it into the scholarly literature. Some of them do not even have a standard dictionary for everyday use, let alone a scientific or technical vocabulary. The speakers of these languages are excluded altogether. Interestingly, however, a few languages other than English, Spanish, and Portuguese do appear in the Latindex databases, as can be seen from the menu on the right side of this slide. The simple act of including them in the databases sends a signal. It is an invitation for authors, readers, librarians, and journal editors to continue using them. In line with language inclusiveness as a matter of principle, Latindex has adhered, of course, to the Helsinki Initiative on multilingualism in scholarly communication. Our principle of inclusiveness encompasses one more dimension, which is unique to the Latindex. No other scholarly journal information system contains in its databases the journals dedicated to the communication of science for professionals or for a broader public. This type of journals are part, in our view, of the universe of scientific journals. And by including them in its information services, the system caters to a larger community of stakeholders. In a nutshell, non-commercial, genuine open access publishing is possible. But it is part of the equation if our purpose is to achieve inclusiveness in a broader sense. Thank you very much.
And if we can play the Professor Luke Drury's presentation, please.
Thank you for the invitation to address this important issue of inclusivity in open science, the equity issues, and the future of publishing. It is an open science meeting, so these slides are being shared under a CC BY 4.0 license. Everyone, I think, agrees that open access is a key, in fact, an indispensable component of open science. But what the last few years have shown us is that an excessive focus on just achieving open access without considering other aspects of open science has led to serious unintended consequences, and ALLEA and many others have pointed this out. The commercial and for-profit publishers have pushed hard to establish gold open access with punitively high article processing charges as their preferred route to open access for understandable reasons. Perhaps less understandably, powerful research performing organizations, major universities, major research institutions have tended to respond by forming consortia and entering into big read and write deals with the main commercial publishers. And this has had the unfortunate consequence of reinforcing serious inequities within the power structures of academia. If anything, the dominance of the big commercial publishers has increased, their profits are up, and they are now rapidly trying to monetize all aspects of the research process. They identify themselves explicitly as not just publishers, but data brokers and analysts. And really, this is best understood as part of what is sometimes called surveillance capitalism. The key point, of course, is that open science is much more than just open access. And the right to participate in science must include the right to actively contribute to science and not just be a passive consumer. Making science the preserve of a privileged elite who have the resources either to fund, either from grants or by membership of big deals, to fund APCs, only breeds distrust and conspiracy theories in the general population, slows the advance of science by restricting the talent pool to those who belong to these elite institutions or have these resources. And if we look at it in a global context, it perpetuates a neocolonial attitude that only science published in accordance with the norms established in the global north and using the systems that are rooted in the traditions of the global north really counts. Clearly a very dangerous attitude. So in short, gold open access with the associated high article processing charges is dangerous to trust in science, it's inefficient, and it's morally wrong. It has also, unfortunately, enabled the pernicious rise of predatory publishing. So how can we envisage a future for publishing which doesn't have these problems? I think it's useful to begin by deconstructing what we mean by publishing, and we tend to conflate three quite distinct stages or activities as part of publishing. First of all, there is the sharing of ideas, of data, of methods with the wider community. This is publishing in the sense of making public. Secondly, there is the critical evaluation of these contributions by one's colleagues and peers, leading to improvements, revisions, and a decision as to whether or not this is really a useful contribution to science. This is the peer review component. And finally, there's the long-term cataloging, cross-referencing, indexing, etc., which enables discovery and retrieval for the future. And this is what one could call the metadata component of publishing. And it's really just an accident of the fact that we have traditions based on movable type and printing on paper that these three components have got combined in the model of the scientific journal. But now that everything is digital and it's all done online, it really doesn't make much sense to conflate them like this, and I think it would be much better if we separated them out and treated them with more appropriate approaches. So in the first one, sharing with colleagues, we have a good way of doing it with preprints. These have been around for over 50 years. They originated because of dissatisfaction with the long delays in getting papers into print. Originally they were just photocopied and distributed by post, now electronic versions posted on dedicated servers. And these provide a more or less optimal solution to the rapid communication and dissemination of new results within the scientific community, as we have seen recently with COVID, now with monkeypox. There are a number of advantages to the preprint route. It provides, in principle, a record of versions rather than a version of records. And if one of those versions happens to be the author-accepted manuscript, then we have an easy route to what is essentially green open access. The community evaluation and peer review. Journal-organized peer review is clearly not working. It doesn't deliver the quality guarantees it claims to. There have been far too many cases of bad articles slipping through, and the journals have a very poor record on corrections and retractions. Having peer review just deliver a binary accept-reject decision based on a small number of unpaid reports from overworked colleagues is really not a very good way of doing it. It would be far better to have a nuanced collection of open community reviews which could situate an article in context and provide a proper evaluation of its significance. And there are interesting experiments in alternative forms of peer review. We have peer community in, overlay journals, F1000, etc. And these offer a very interesting alternative to the traditional journal route, which actually is not even that traditional. It really only took off after the Second World War. Finally, there's the issue of discovery and archiving. It's no use publishing if it can't be found. And I don't think nowadays anyone continues to scan the tables of contents in journals anymore. We all rely on various recommendation and search engines or social media references. And I think there's a very strong case for saying that these should be platform agnostic but discipline specific, as in the case of the astrophysical data system. I'm an astrophysicist, so I'm very familiar with this, which basically it treats all the major journals and the minor journals and the preprint servers on an equal footing. It's a very efficient and quick way of finding information. And it's in this context, it's worth pointing out that the metadata associated with an article, the author list, the affiliations, the bibliography, etc., are now actually valuable commodities in their own right, and it's important that we try and keep this in the public domain. So I would urge you to support initiatives like OpenAlex, Crossref, ORCID, etc. We can't really let this be the exclusive property of Web of Science or Scopus, etc. Finally, of course, long-term curation of digital content is seriously under-resourced, and we really need to think about a global digital repository system similar to the great copyright deposit libraries of the past. So open science without article processing charges is perfectly possible. And here's just a list of recommendations, which you're all familiar with, so I won't go through them in detail. There's one big problem, which is that what the commercial journals are actually selling and what allows them to set outrageously high APCs is not access, but signals of research excellence. And in any hyper-competitive system with asymmetric information, even bad proxy signals assume undue importance. One thinks, for example, of the stag which invests enormous metabolic effort in growing a large set of antlers each year simply to demonstrate his potential health as a breeding mate. Now, somehow we need to signal research quality without being forced to resort to saying published in Cell or PRL or Nature as a proxy, and a very poor proxy, as Dora has pointed out. So the challenge I would like to leave with the younger generation is this: can we develop digital badges of excellence allocated by some form of open peer review and attached directly to research outputs, not just papers, but also data sets, software, protocols, etc., which would then bypass this whole problem of the journals being used as proxies for excellence. If we can do this, and I believe it can be done, then I think we would see the traditional journals wither away. And I would like to leave this as a challenge for the global young academies here to think about: can you do this and solve this problem? Thank you.
If we can play Professor Abdullah Shams bin Tariq's presentation next, please.
It is indeed a privilege for me to address you from Bangladesh on alternative funding models for open access. As many of us are aware, the Budapest Open Access Initiative celebrated its 20th anniversary this year, and they made a new set of 10-year recommendations, and they stuck to only 4. And of these 4, number 3 was on article processing charges. In this recommendation, they have recommended moving away from our APCs, and they've also claimed that alternatives have long existed, but they are systematically under-noticed, under-discussed, underappreciated, and underfunded, and underused. Today, I'm going to talk about a few of these alternatives. And it is interesting to note that only last year, we also had 2 more major reports or recommendations, one coming from the International Science Council in the form of 8 principles for reform of scientific publishing, and the other from UNESCO in the form of its recommendations on open science. So there are similar elements in both of these, but it is most explicit in the Budapest Open Access Initiative recommendations. It is claimed that any research is funded by someone and they could pay the APCs. And that is the argument that goes behind author pays open access. Firstly, this is not true for most authors or institutions, and it creates a barrier for the authors, which can be equally discriminating. But what is perhaps more important is that this leads to perverse incentives. So it's not a matter of openness alone, it's something that is detrimental to the integrity of scientific publishing. Publishers no longer need to sell to readers. They can sacrifice quality. More acceptances mean higher revenues. And a briefcase business can easily become a publisher. There is no dearth of authors needing a publication. And authors do not have the bargaining power. So author charges can be hiked at will. Libraries also did not have much because subscription rates kept going higher, but still they could form consortia and undertake some level of bargaining, which authors can never do. So these slipping standards, they provide perverse incentives that lead not only to predatory publishers and predatory journals, but even legitimate publishers indulging in predatory practices. And this was one of the findings in the recent IAP report on predatory journals and practices, journals and conferences, where instead of a binary classification of predatory and non-predatory journals, it was claimed that we should look at a continuum of predatory practices. And that is why we often see nowadays new journals with lower entry barriers to cater for leftovers, because it makes perfect sense in this business model. So what are the alternative funding models? First of all, I think everyone would claim, and it has already been mentioned today, that there are whole ecosystems like Latin America, where academic publishing is in principle not for profit. It is funded institutionally. And this is perhaps the best example of diamond open access. 69% of the DOAD journals are not APC-based journals. And there are also great examples of green open access, like the archive, flourishing in certain disciplines and extending now to many others. So this should be our ultimate aim, a combination of these so-called green and diamond open access. However, the challenge is a bit more serious when it comes to transforming closed to open. And here I bring before you the example of Scope 3. And then I will also talk about the Open Library of Humanities and subscribe to open models. So Scope 3 is the sponsoring consortium for open access of publications in particle physics. Basically, libraries come together to pool their subscription money and use that to sponsor open access. The amount contributed by each country or institution is calculated according to the number of articles published by them or their share in the worldwide scientific output in particle physics. So it's kind of, it depends on the number of authors or the number of articles. And it achieves open access in the end. So it repurposes the same subscription money, but in the end, we have open access. So it would be wonderful if this model could be expanded to include all the disciplines of the world. But people would argue that this does not work for other disciplines, because in other disciplines, we do not have the same culture of the archive and preprints like particle physics, or we don't have a major body like CERN, which can rally people around it. So perhaps the dynamics of different disciplines are not the same. And in this sense, this model does not scale. Interestingly, the next good example comes from humanities in the name of the Open Library of Humanities, which is somewhat similar to Scope 3, because it's again a consortium of libraries that makes the payment, and there are no author-facing charges at all. But the concern now is that both Scope 3 and OLH rely on community action. You need someone to be there to rally people together to make this community. What if the community does not exist or cannot unite? So here we come to the subscribe to open models, pioneered by annual reviews with key input from RIME Pro, among others. The idea is that they set a certain threshold, and if the total subscription crosses that threshold, the journal is flipped to open access. It still uses the same library funds, but the ultimate aim is open access. It has been tested by a number of publishers, including PLOS, DTP Sciences. The encouraging news is that annual reviews started with 5 titles. They had an extended program going all the way to 2032, but they recently announced that in the next year, 2023, all of their 51 titles will be offered under the S2O model. And there are more from different publishers that are exploring S2O in the next year and this year. However, this is not so new as an idea, because in their open access policy white paper of 2015 from the Max Planck Digital Library, Schimmer, Jesson, and Vogler made the following key observations. One is that there is already enough money in the system in terms of subscription money, and that can be used, that can be repurposed to achieve open access. And neither the libraries nor publishing houses need to lose their roles. It's not writing them off, but it's transforming them. Unfortunately, these pragmatic ideas lost their way in the wave of author pays open access. And we now need to bring them back to the forefront. So the challenge really is that Plan S, though it formally does not support any particular model, but it is a coalition of funders, Coalition S. So they initially started with a mandate that all research funded by them the authors who get their funds will pay the APCs to make them open access. So that resulted in a major swing in favor of the author pays model. And notice one thing, that the open access movement was a fight against the publishers' paywalls. But suddenly we find most publishers posing to be open access friendly, perhaps because they find this model good for their business. They're quite tired of fighting leakages like Sci-Hub. Author pays has already established itself as the main and to some the only route to OA, particularly for switching. And it will be very difficult to turn the tide. So to conclude, I just would like to say that we are already seeing many ill effects, and this needs to be understood, that this is a fundamentally flawed design, APC-based open access or author-pays open access. There is a great danger, and very few people appreciate that we are slipping in the wrong direction. But the hope is that there is a growing community of concerned people and organizations. Workable ideas and alternative models exist, and there are encouraging first results. There's already enough money in the system. We just need to repurpose the existing funds. No need to look elsewhere. But this will be a very uphill battle. A clear understanding and involvement is needed for people like you all. In the end, we need to reclaim ownership of academic publishing. Thank you.
And with the final presentation by Professor Fernanda Beigel.
Well, hello everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you, and I thank a lot everyone for this invitation. I think that this session in which we're participating is intended to discuss how to promote inclusiveness and open access publishing models, and well, I'm going to try to make my contribution related to the process of approval and discussion of the open science recommendation at the UNESCO. Since I come from Argentina and I'm based on the city of Mendoza, which is a medium-sized province in the country, I hope I can make a contribution to the discussion of the global asymmetries that are behind the context in which this recommendation was discussed, and how this, or what implications this has into the idea of open science, and particularly in open access. And just to say a few words related to the open science recommendation, I would say that open science is a very interesting project that has gained a lot of consensus, but it needed a global framework, and I think that the recommendation by UNESCO offered this to researchers, with librarians, students, and other actors in the process of scientific production and circulation. So I think that we gained with this text the consensual definition of open science, the shared principles and values, and a set of actions that are needed in order to boost this project into reality. But the road for the recommendation implied a lot of discussions in between the experts, the 30 experts that were part of the advisory committee. In these previous discussions, we could find that low and medium income countries had different situations towards the possibilities of advancing on open science. And so when you see the basis of, or the main pillars of what open science means, it of course means open access and the idea of open scientific knowledge, the open science infrastructure, and the open dialogue with other knowledge systems, and finally the open engagement with social actors. So the different areas of action for this open science project is related to scientific publications, open research data, open educational resources, open resource software and source code, and open hardware, of course. Now, in those discussions among all these experts, we could find that from different countries, not only southern countries or low-income countries, we found that there were a lot of asymmetries that were of critical impact in the process of thinking or development the open science project. First of all, of course, the digital divide, the developmental inequalities that affect all the process of scientific production and circulation, multilingualism, which is at stake in the process of what we've seen as the hypercentrality of English in all the scientific publication databases, and how this is boosted by the research assessment systems in most countries, and of course by the university rankings and all other type of rankings that are critical for funding and institutional accreditation. The other issue is bibliodiversity, because these type of indicators that are used in research assessment have long imposed certain ways and forms of publishing, and papers in mainstream databases are the most rewarded. So books and other ways of communicating science have been normally not stimulated. So it's all the experts agreed that it was critical to promote high quality responsible research, and it was critical to go beyond the impact factor and to promote responsible metrics. Now, if we focus now on open access and how the open access movement and the open science movement has had an impact, and particularly after the COVID pandemic and all the changes that we lived in the last 2 years, we've seen that a very fast, transformative academic publishing industry that has changed all its practices, and having a very important impact in many, many journals that have transformed to open access. But this open access has mostly, and particularly in the European journals that are indexed in Scopus, have advanced towards a business model that includes the APC. This is the article processing charges that are now transferred to the authors or the institutions if they sign these transformative agreements. But how can we measure how these APC have affected the low and medium income countries? It's very difficult, really, because APC studies at the national scale are mostly based on projections. They use mostly in bibliometric studies the corresponding author when this person is based in these countries. And we have very interesting examples, recent studies for Colombia, Chile, Brazil, and particularly for Argentina. In a study that I participated, we could see that in between 2013 and 2020, a total expenditure of $11 million, $634 was made But this is a projection, and we don't exactly know if this corresponding author paid this amount and how and from which type of funds, national funds, international. But what we do know is that we have an APC study at a global scale. We have several, but I'm going to just mention this last one, in which a real amount paid to oligopolies in between 2015 and 2018 has been estimated. And with these sources that you see in this in your screen, from Web of Science and the OA status from Unpaywall and other open data sources, the estimation payment by the authors to the oligopoly of academic publishers is of 1.06 billion in publication fees in this 4-period analyzed. So what Butler, Matias, Imad, Monroe, and Hostein are saying in this study is that there is a shift from the reader pays to author pays, and this merely switches the revenues that were paid before by institutions to major companies from the subscription model to open access. In this study that I was saying that we have in Argentina, we have seen that there is a difference between the total amount paid that we have estimated in $11,634 with the funds that we could register in an empirical way in the Agencia de Investigación y Desarrollo, which is our main national agency for research funds, because what came out of the Argentinian institution, the Argentinian funds, was only $1,317. The period is 2013 to 2020. And so where does this difference from 11 million to 1 million come? We have not been able to register funds coming from individual universities, because this is a national fund that goes to all universities or CONICET. But we could estimate the funds from CONICET and the funds from 1 or 2 universities that have really research funds. Majorly, all the universities depend on this agencia, but it's really minimum. We haven't advanced yet in registering exactly how much it is. But what we can say is that mostly this total that was paid in this period that goes until 2020, and so you can see that all the advances in 2021 and currently in open access with APC are not considered. And all this difference comes mostly because other authors are paying, or because other institutions are paying, or the international funds. So how can a country like Argentina face this type of increase in APC funds? What we could see also is that these payments of APC, according to the disciplinary area of the person in charge of the project, of the director, we could find that this was mainly affecting one specific scientific area, which includes many disciplines, as you know, which is biological sciences and health. The percentage of funds of disciplines that in biology that are involved in this expenditure is 62.7%, while the other, the second one in importance is agriculture, and the third natural sciences, and of course social sciences with a minimum participation. But now if we center ourselves in the relationship between diamond type of open access and APC type of open access, there is a global report by Operas, which is very interesting because we can see there that there are many journals in open access, and this source is TOAC, but for Latin America, which is in the middle, you can see that you have like 2,900 journals, but we have a lot more. We have 6,000 journals in Latin America, and only 130 are with APC. The rest are university-based or these type of models that come from scientific society, and they are in the majority diamond type of open access journals. And if we see only Cielo and Redalic, we have a project that's called Oliva, and collected all the information for both regional indexing systems, and we could find that from 1,720 journals that are indexed in these two systems, 90% are diamond journals. Only 182 journals have APC, which 60% are from Brazil, and only about 10 journals really have a high APC. The rest are scientific societies with APCs coming from $100 to $2,250. So Latin America is offering really a very important space for the circulation in Diamond Open Access. We have the grace to have in this table María Cetto, which is also a very dear friend and with whom we collaborate a lot. And we have a third indexing system, a very important group of journals that are indexed in Latindex. These are more than 3,000 journals in which we have, she's going to talk about this of course, but we have also a great majority of Diamond Access quality journals at work. And so what can we do coming from Latin America, which is the space that I know, and taking into account all these asymmetries in the global scale that I've been commenting? First of all, I think that we have to, the most important policies and actions have to go in the research assessment systems. We have to create, and that's what we proposed the Argentinian government with this study that I mentioned, we have to create assessment rewards for quality peer-reviewed Diamond Access publications indexed in international regional databases. We have to make an attempt to help this shift to Diamond Access and journals that are really managed by the community, the academic community, and not by the oligopolies. I think that an initial requirement that could be not so difficultly applied is to try to ask for a requirement for one article published in Diamond journals to start boosting this type of practice in our researchers. The other one is to strengthen national and regional journals and their value in research assessment. Translation policies to support really these national journals that could be edited in various languages and not only in local language, but without giving up with our local languages, but with multilingual journals. The Chinese experience is very important in this sense, because you know that the reform that they are managing now in the Chinese scientific system is starting to give more value to the Chinese journals, right? The other one, I think, is to increase institutional support for university repositories. This is green access. We can also try to stimulate workshops with researchers from different disciplines to create new strategies for open science access visibility without APC. I think we have to focus in policies to support the disciplines most affected by APC increases and to understand particularly the situation of biology and health science in terms of international funds, national funds, and publishing to see specific policies for these disciplines. I think we have to lead also scientific diplomacy between universities, research councils, ministries of science and technology to create regional networks, particularly in Latin America, where this is very possible, to support Diamond Open Access and responsible metrics. And finally, I think we have to demand a fairer treatment for low and medium income countries to commercial oligopolies, and in order to be able to access to this, we have to seek for support in the Global Research Council or in the International Science Council and other agencies. I think this is all, and I thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for these insightful talks. Allow me to start with a question. If I can start with Luke. Basically, I'd like to ask that with such a large number of publications, how would the higher quality papers stand out in the system that you had suggested? And wouldn't there be a concern if digital badges of excellence are adopted, that this would still create inequities where scientists that are from elite institutes and have larger grants would automatically get more of these proposed badges? And along the same kind of line, I'd like to ask also Ariel about this. I'd like to ask him that if we have the caps for APCs, as he also suggested within his talk, that just a second. So if we have the cap for the APCs, if we have for developed countries higher caps than those for developing countries, if that would also cause inequalities.
Yeah, if I can, I mean, obviously any system can be gamed and all systems of assessment have problems. What I would say is I think the current system is clearly broken and surely we can do a better job. I think it is inevitable that we have to look at the quality of individual outputs. Okay, I think my video's come on now. Good, thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, I think the point is, as everyone who's looked at this has ended up concluding that it's intertwined with the whole question of research assessment. How do you actually value research outputs? Who does it? It can only be done by some sort of community peer review process. We are the only people who can actually judge the quality of research outputs. The problem is we have no good way at the moment of indicating which outputs we think are valuable. And if that's the point I was trying to make, that at the moment we're using published in Nature as a proxy for quality, and that's causing all the problems we're talking about, or at least a lot of the problems we're talking about.
Yeah, that's true. Ariel?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I am happy to participate of this because many of the talks have complemented other points that I did not approach because of the short time. About the proposal of capping the payment of APCs that we made to some of our funding agencies, this was just this is not a structural proposal, of course. This is just to start to shaken a bit some kind of comfort that some people having much more resources feel because they can pay, so they can go ahead and they don't care about the others. We tried to create, and this was a kind of experiment, we tried to create a more equal situation to everyone. So it doesn't matter if you have funds or not, you are not allowed to pay over a certain value, that in our case is more or less $2,000. This is what our main funding agency is now allowing us to pay. And we are following up this because this creates a tool as well to negotiate with the journals. One thing that was pointed out by one of the speakers was the fact that this really creates a big inequality, and we really feel that because when some of our postdocs or PhD students that goes abroad needs to compete for going ahead with their careers with other people coming from more rich groups in other places, and they are judged as if they were making a lower quality science because they could not publish in these papers. This is a bit what Luke just said about the prestige of publishing in some journals. And in fact, complementing a bit what Luke said, I would like to say that indeed journals transformed themselves in machines of selling prestige and not scientific information. And this is something that we need to pay attention on.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. If I can turn to Shams now. So Shams, I found your final remark very interesting, that there's enough money in the system and we need to repurpose it. I think that's really great. So what does that mean, that there is money from journal subscription? Are you suggesting that we go back to paying that, or how would that work? If you can elaborate more on that, please.
What I meant to say is that, I mean, there are libraries that are subscribing, that are there is money in the in the libraries that is allocated for subscription. So there are models where you can repurpose this money and make it fund open access. So we get open access, but it's using the same money that is now being used for library subscriptions. So that preserves the integrity of the system in a much better way. So this is what all these models that I have mentioned, they try to do in some way or other.
Excellent, thank you. So if I can turn now to the questions in the chat. Martin Dominic has been very active in the questions, and I think some of his questions have already been answered by the speakers, but I'm going to take some of them. So Martin shared with us 2 recent publications by the Open Science Group in the network of young academies, so you can have a look at them if interested. And Martin asks, just let me see. So shouldn't we actually encourage communicating the same research findings in various tailored forms to suit specific audiences rather than viewing that as self-plagiarism, which is technically a self-contradictory term? I think he was commenting on one of the comments. So if any of you would like to comment on this. On the same note, also Martin talks about Luke's challenge that and I think Luke already explained this, we mistake publications for a mark of excellence, which is mostly understood as productivity, popularity, and impact. I think already Luke discussed this point. So if we can go back to the point of self-plagiarism, and wouldn't be something good to have the same publication but in different forms to suit different audiences? If any of you would like to comment on this.
Yes, I think it would be a great idea.
That's good. That's very quick.
And in fact, it fits in with the idea that you should have a record of versions rather than a version of record. So there's no reason why you shouldn't publish if you publish your work in the local language and in English, it seems to me.
Yes.
In fact, I think, Martin was trying to allude to another issue, because the whole argument behind open access has been that everything should be available to everyone. But we need to realize that even we as academics, we find it difficult to read papers that are outside our specialization. So, making research papers available to everyone is not something that is actually helping everyone, because it's not like I'm going to, as a patient, I'm going to read a scientific paper and I'm going to treat my family member. I'm not going to do it. It's not possible. So you actually need different versions for. You need the research paper for your fellow researchers, for your fellow scientists, but you need something else to. So for example, if you have a paper in medicine, you need something else for the doctors, which is something else that will go some other version of it to go to the public audience, and I think that's what Martin is trying to talk about, and that should be made open access, really.
Ariel, you had a comment.
Yes, a word about the idea of self-plagiarism. I think that this is the basis of our assessment system, which is a complete crisis. If you count numbers, number of papers and so on, of course this becomes a problem. The thing is that we need to change that.
Thank you. Another question by Jessica. Basically, how do we negotiate the wide accessibility and ease of sharing knowledge provided by a single publishing language, i.e. English, with the idea of returning to multilingual publishing? Who would care to answer this?
I think there is no option. You have to return. It's not a matter of returning. Actually, multilingual publishing exists. it's a bias that we have, which is totally non-inclusive. So we have to grow beyond that. And I think, I mean, current technology provides many answers or many solutions, and we should just gradually adopt them more and more, and that should be fine. I mean, I don't think we can go back to the time when, you know, a physicist would have to learn English and German and French to study, but there are other solutions now.
We have.
Sorry, if I could come in. Actually, if you do mathematics, you do need to still be able to read French. One point I would like to make, though, is, I mean, the more open we make science, the greater the responsibility also to think about the consequences of what we're publishing. And particularly, you made the example of medicine. If you publish medical papers and people start self-medicating with, well, we think of hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin on the basis of flawed publications, we do need to think about the consequences of what we're doing. I mean, open access is open science, open access is great, but it does increase the responsibility on scientists to behave in a responsible and ethical manner. And that is something that I think isn't addressed often enough.
Thank you. There is a question from Irvi Gledhill, and she's with us in the room. She'd like to ask the questions directly.
Hi. I'm not convinced that there is enough money in the system for various reasons.
I think you need to press on the microphone.
Okay, is that better? Nope?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm not convinced there is enough money in the system for various reasons. The first one is in low middle income countries. Second one, where universities are growing. And it's not the case in countries where large fractions of the GDP were needed to cope with COVID or lost during COVID. So my question is, can we form the IAP, ISC, TWAS model to work for equitable open access through one of the models proposed today, like subscription to open, or global diamond, or global funding agreements for APCs?
I think, Luke, you can start.
Well, I think the first point...
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, do you want me to... Yeah.
Yes, all of you, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me start. I mean, I think the first thing to be said is, in many ways, open science is a response to the extraordinary technological shift of going online and modern data storage. And the costs are incredibly cheap, actually, compared to the old days of printing on paper. So yes, there is enough money in the system, certainly for the typical articles. The big question actually is about open data, where the repositories are much, much larger and more expensive. And there hasn't been enough infrastructure investment. That is true. But as far as traditional articles and open access is concerned, yes, there is more than enough money in the system, in my view.
I'd like to actually add a point. I mean, I think yes. The concern raised in the question is valid, because it's like there is enough money in the system in aggregate. So you have to bring everyone together. So maybe if you count a single country that may not have enough subscription money to pool all their, that may have been struggling to subscribe, so it may have not enough money in the system. But overall, the whole academic publishing process in the global, on the global scale, as Luke has mentioned, I mean, gone on. And
I think we have a problem with Sham's connection. We have to finish. So Ariel, do you have any final comment before we go to closing remarks?
Well, I would like to remark the relevance of the actions that we can take inside academia, and I think that they are in big part the main cause of what we see. I mean, it is said, the last question about if there is enough money in the system and so on. I wonder myself how much more than needed we are publishing, because we are basing careers on counting papers. And how much more journals are there than we need, because we need to have enough venues to publish our research, because we need so I think that we have a big power of modifying our own reality, which will impact on the global model of the. So I think that we need to start urgently this reflection.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists. Excellent presentations. There's still plenty of questions in the chat. I could not go through them. If you'd like to quickly answer some of them by typing. I will give the floor now to Luciana Balboa for giving the closing remarks. I'd like to thank her and Franco Caberizo for helping in organizing this session. And after that, we'll move to the poll. Thank you all. And Luciana, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Rula, and thanks to the panelists for such standing presentations, and especially the debate during the questions and answer sessions. It was great. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to provide you some key messages taken from this session, which I'm sure has been enlightening for all of us. In this regard, we are aware of the fact that global bodies have elaborated several prominent statements on open access that provide important insights on how to mitigate the lack of inclusiveness generated by the current dominant route to publication, which is based on abusive author-paid article processing costs, known as gold open access. However, the lack of regulations and concerted actions to address this issue caused the system to evolve in unforeseen directions. The shift towards a more inclusive publishing models does not necessarily involve seeking additional funding for article processing charges, but the reuse of existing money already available for scientific production and circulation to encourage the advancements of alternative open access models, along with the active support of the scientific community by submitting high-quality research on such platforms and provided adequate reward for it. Contributed to the dissemination and growth of alternatives to open access, such as diamond and green routes, and to the implementations of alternative models for research evaluation, will alleviate the negative impact of the gold open access publication model, leading to a more inclusive scientific ecosystem, as well as reducing predatory publishing practices. Well, thank you again for your participation, and I hope that concrete actions will come out of today's sessions in which each of us can actually contribute to making open science truly inclusive. So